Welcome everyone to the Billy Bishop for Skeptics in the Pub / the BC Humanists present Chris Stedman, the Faitheist. Yay. We were taking sort of a relaxed dinner. Chris was supposed to fly in a bit earlier into Seattle to see some of his friends this morning, but I guess the airplane sucked a bird into the engine, so that plane was out of commission for this morning, so he had to shuttle halfway across Washington to fly into Seattle, and then he got a quick ride up here, but we're all good now, so he had some chance to relax. He's been on the road for 4 or 5 days straight, with as many talks in between, just straight, so thank him for taking some time out of his life to speak to us about his life. As I said, my name's Ian Bushfield. The BC Humanist Association is sponsoring tonight and is happy to host Chris Stedman. The association, if you'll just grant me 2 minutes to talk about it because we're here, we try to advocate for the non-religious of BC. We're trying to build a community based on reason, compassion, and hope as the 3 values James Croft at Harvard Humanist elucidated humanism as. We just released a study of BC polling the province in terms of are you religious, and we found 2/3 of this province isn't, and 30% either doesn't or doesn't know whether or not a higher power exists. So the numbers are really strong. It's a very secular province that I think still craves value and meaning, and so it'll be interesting to hear Chris speak about that. Our organization is a democratic membership-based organization, so I encourage you to think about joining or donating to the association so we can continue to put on events like this, polls like we just did, and other work. We have a number of our new board members here tonight who can introduce themselves later, or you can just talk to me, or visit our website at bchumanist.ca. So tonight, I'm very proud to introduce Chris Stedman. Chris is the Assistant Humanist Chaplain at Harvard University, which is a very impressive title, I think.
Bizarre title.
I think it's a word. I would be proud of that title. Chris will talk, I'm sure, about his book that he's just published, which is titled Faitheist, how sort of an atheist gets around and really got into interfaith activism and how he decided that's where he wants to spend his time. The new atheists are very well known for their firebrand approach, their, confront religion, take it down. Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss have a new documentary out called The Unbelievers, where they go around sort of like Bill Maher and Religulous, trying to expose the irrationality of faith. Chris Stedman's approach, from what I can tell, and he can tell you if I'm wrong, is to try to understand people and try to get to know the people apart from their ideas, try to learn and listen and be friends and make friends. So with that, I'll let you take over. Chris.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. It's been a while since I've spoken in a bar, but I have to say it's not the first time, and I'm hoping it won't be the last. This is my first time in Vancouver, though. I've only been to Canada one other time in my life. I grew up in Minnesota, and I crossed just over the border into Thunder Bay, Ontario, and that's it. Nice. So, and I think I was like 6 years old or something. So this is truly my first experience in Canada, and I couldn't be happier to be spending it with the BC Humanists and Skeptics in the Pub. So thank you all for coming tonight and inviting me to come and hang out with you. So I want to tell you a little bit about some of my background and how I got into doing interfaith work as an atheist. I actually grew up in a secular household. I would identify my family as more irreligious than non-religious. I never heard the word atheist in my household growing up, but I didn't hear the word God either. We just really didn't talk about religion at all. And as I was growing up, I began to recognize that religion as a phenomenon existed in the world. One of my closest friends when I was in 3rd grade was Jewish and was very involved in her community. And so as I was getting older, I began to recognize this and became increasingly curious about religion. But when I was 11 years old, I had a really dramatic conversion experience and went from being irreligious to being an evangelical Christian. And reflecting back on my conversion, I think that there were sort of 2 primary factors that that set me up to be very interested in that kind of conversion. The first is that about a year prior, when I was around 10 years old, I started reading books like Roots, Hiroshima, The Diary of Anne Frank. These were books that not only increased my awareness of some of the greatest atrocities that have occurred throughout human history, but they told the story of what it was like for people who had experienced these events. And reading these books filled me with concern and with questions about what it meant to live in a world where humans would treat one another in this way. What the meaning of life was, as much as any 10-year-old can entertain that question. And I found myself really just very concerned about these questions of meaning and justice and purpose. And so I was looking for a way to make sense of those things. And then about a year later, my parents separated. And my family was very tight-knit growing up. We didn't go to church on Sundays. We would spend the day as a family making dinner together, cleaning the house, listening to records. And when my parents separated, my family dynamic changed immediately. My mother entered the workforce and started working multiple jobs. And it was very disruptive. I suddenly felt like this stability that I had had in my life was absent. And so I was looking for structure and a support system. And as I was looking for that, I had friends from school who, I have to say, were a little bit more popular than I was, which played a role in my, I think, being very interested in their offer. I mean, I was a finalist in the Minnesota Geography Bee, and when they announced that over the loudspeaker in school, my fate was sealed. And so when these more popular kids invited me to go to this after-school youth group at a non-denominational church and told me that there would be free pizza there, no less, I was very drawn to the idea. And so I went and immediately was so impressed by how welcoming the community was. I remember getting a phone call a week after my first visit where the youth minister called me at home to ask if I'd be coming again and to ask how a math test that I had expressed some anxiety about had gone. And just the fact that he thought to follow up with me and that so many people in the community seemed so excited that I was there and interested in me was very appealing during a time of uncertainty and transition. And so it met my sort of need for community and stability right away. And it gave me some answers to some of these questions that I was wrestling with about meaning and purpose. They told me that people who did bad things would get punished in the end, and people who had bad things done to them would be redeemed. And so that seemed very appealing to me. And so I decided that this was a great fit, that the things that they said made sense, and they were so welcoming that I wanted to be a part of this community. And so I became an evangelical Christian, a rather fundamentalist one. And yet, just a few months after my converting, I began to recognize that they weren't quite as welcoming as they initially seemed when I realized that I was queer. And this was a church that was very vocally and vehemently anti-gay. They preached anti-gay messages in their sermons on Sundays. They talked about it frequently in small group Bible study and discussion. The library of the church was full of resources that said that homosexuality was at best a mistake and at worst a sign of demonic possession. And so, and I mean, as an 11-year-old, I really didn't have a framework for parsing this out, for seeing some of the gray areas in what they were saying. And so I internalized this message, and I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that, you know, as I alluded to earlier, I wasn't exactly the coolest kid in school. And so when I realized that I was gay, this was just another thing that set me apart from other people. It was another thing that separated me from people, and I was looking to be a part of something. And so I didn't want to be different, and when they told me in the resources that they had in their library that homosexuality was something that could be changed or fixed or resolved through religious practice, I took that message to heart, in part because I didn't really want to be gay. And so I set about trying to change my sexual orientation through religious practice. I became a dedicated faster. I would fast every day. I would spend my my lunch periods in my evangelical math teacher's classroom fasting while all my friends were at lunch having fun and eating food. And I would spend most of my free time in Bible study alone, usually. I carried this big, colorful teen study Bible with me on top of all my books at school, trying to show the world that I was the perfect model Christian. And when I would get home from school, I would go straight to my room and do Bible study. And that was, I guess, you know, the grand irony of my converting, was I became a Christian because I was looking for community and I was looking for a way to make sense of injustice and suffering. But what ended up happening is I retreated within myself. I isolated myself off from my family and my friends, and my personal level of suffering increased really significantly. So this process went on for a number of years, and as it went on and I was seeing no sign of a change, I grew sort of increasingly frustrated. I felt like I was doing something wrong, or my prayers weren't being answered. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew that I was mad about it and hurt and upset. And I got to a very low point, but fortunately at that point my mother found the prayer journal that I was keeping where I was detailing the struggle I was going through. And she read it, and she went to the phone book, called up local churches in the community, found a church just about a mile from my house with a minister who could offer an alternate perspective on homosexuality, and took me to speak with him the next day. And I was very grateful for that intervention, obviously. It was a huge turning point in my life. And I have to say, if she had, because you know, my mother didn't raise me to be a Christian, and like a good evangelical, I did get my whole family to start going to church with me, but I don't really think that my mom was much of a Christian, if at all, at that point. And you know, I have to say, if her response to finding that journal had been to say, just throw out that nonsense, forget about Christianity, just accept who you are, it really wouldn't have worked for me. I really needed someone who could tell me from a Christian perspective that it was okay for me to be gay, that it was okay for me to be the person that I was. And I'm really fortunate and very grateful that she recognized that and took me to speak with someone who could give me those resources. So after that, I moved into progressive, liberal Christian churches and became very involved in them throughout my time in high school. And actually, I found acceptance in liberal Christian churches for being gay before I found it in my public high school. And the kids who teased and bullied me for being the only openly gay kid in school, you know, they were not people that were regular churchgoers. I don't know how many of them were religious, but I do know that in that space, I felt very unsafe. But when I went to church, I knew that I was safe and would be accepted. And so having that experience really made me feel like the church was where I wanted to be. And I began to rationalize these negative experiences that I had had within Christianity as a way for me to better understand the experience of suffering, so that I could work with people who suffered. I wanted to help people like I had been helped. And the people who had helped me the most in terms of coming to terms with my sexual orientation were Christian ministers. And so I felt like if I want to help people in that way, then that's what I need to do. I need to become a Christian minister. And so I decided I was going to go to a Lutheran college to study religion, and then after that go to seminary and become a Lutheran minister. I was in Minnesota. It's land of the Lutherans, so it wasn't surprising I ended up there. But when I got to college and started studying religion in an academic way, as has been the case for others in this room, I know, it really challenged my thinking on religion. Learning about the way in which the Bible was assembled was a really eye-opening and honestly traumatizing experience for me. And as I began to learn more about the origins of Christianity, I did a research project my first semester of college on Gnostic Christianity and the Matrix. I thought I was being really cool. Turns out a lot of people have made that connection. It wasn't but as I was engaging in that kind of study, I began to ask a lot more questions about what I actually believed. And it was my Christian professors at this Lutheran institution who really pushed me to ask myself critical questions about what I believe and why. They challenged me to defend my beliefs. They were particularly interested in the fact that I had had this conversion when I was 11 years old, and I think they were a bit suspicious of it. And so as they pushed me to explain what I believed and why, I found myself really unable to justify my belief in God. And as I began to reflect on it more, I began to recognize that for me, what had drawn me into Christianity really wasn't this idea of God. It was the sense of community, and it was the idea of being a part of a group of people who were committed to ideas about justice and then actually doing something about them to help their fellow human beings. But I realized that those things had been important to me long before I became a Christian. I was raised to value community and relationships. I was raised to treat other people kindly and to try to help people when they're in need. And when I realized that there wasn't a connection there between what I cared about most and the concept of God, I realized that for me, I had just taken on the idea of a God as a part of a package deal, right? I saw this community of people who said, we care about these same things that you care about, and we care about them because of God. And the way that I made sense of that was to say, oh, well, they care about the same things I do. They cite God as the reason why they care about them. Therefore, I must also believe in this thing that they believe in. But I realized that I was underwhelmed by the evidence that was presented for the existence of God. And so I began to sort of distance myself from Christianity and eventually decided I was an atheist. But when I realized I was an atheist, I was, in the middle of a religion degree at a religious institution. I had all of these friends that I had made through the church growing up, and I had no idea what to do with myself. And so, I was very happy to sort of argue about theology in the classroom. It was one of my favorite things to do, actually, especially because I was surrounded by Christians. But when it came to talking to religious people about the way in which they connected their beliefs to the way that they lived their lives, I found myself having a really difficult time with those conversations. And as a concrete example of this, I would, several days a week, I volunteered at a community center just down the street from where I went to school. And this community center primarily served recent immigrants from Somalia. The majority of the folks who visited this community center were Muslims. And I was studying Islam in the classroom and felt like I was learning about it and learning why I thought that Islamic beliefs were incorrect. But when it came to actually talking to the Muslims that I worked with, I really had a hard time with that. I'd never really actually had any significant interactions with Muslims before. And one day I was staying late after having volunteered, and I was talking with a woman who I had met a few times before, and we were talking about we were shooting the breeze, if you will. We were talking about, I think, how bad the NBA team in Minnesota was doing, which is very par for the course. And for those of you who pay attention to basketball, I guess not that many.
It's hockey night in Canada.
Oh, well, I'm from Minnesota, so I should know better. Hockey is much bigger there. But so we were just talking about, this and that, and I don't remember exactly how it came about, but she suddenly said to me that sometimes when she would go out in public wearing a head covering, she wore a hijab, that she would feel very nervous and afraid. She had people who would shout things at her. She had friends who had had things thrown at them. And, she just kind of confided in me that this was something that she was really nervous about. And, I responded without really thinking, and I said, sometimes when I'm out in public with my boyfriend, when he tries to hold my hand, I feel really nervous because we've had people shout things at us before, and I'm also afraid of being harassed or attacked. So in some way, I feel like I can really relate to what you're talking about. And as soon as I said that, I was like, oh, fuck. Because, I wasn't out to anyone at the center as queer, and I certainly wasn't out as an atheist. And I had, tried to really sort of keep these boundaries in place so that I didn't have to talk to them about who I was, what I believed in, and I didn't have to talk to them about what they believed in. And so I really didn't know what her response was going to be. But really without missing a beat, she said to me, so what do you do in those moments when you feel afraid? For me, it is my belief in God, my belief that Allah is watching over me, and that there's a plan for me that provides a sense of comfort for me, but I realize I don't really know what you believe, so I'm curious, what is it for you? Where's your source of strength? And she was inviting me into this honest conversation about what she believed, what I believed, what some of our experiences were, and really it was an opportunity for me to learn from someone who has had profoundly different experiences than I have, who believes profoundly different things than I do. And it was an opportunity for me to learn it from a fellow human being rather than simply reading a book about Islam, to learn about how her Islamic beliefs informed the way that she lived her life. And yet, I felt, suddenly very uncomfortable. And so I made up some excuse about having a paper that was due the next day, and I just took off, really. And as the years went by, I began to reflect on that conversation and others, and just my overall sort of unwillingness or discomfort with talking to people who have different religious beliefs than I do in a context other than in the classroom in an academic setting. And I began to see them as real missed opportunities. I began to see incidents like that one as a real missed opportunity for me to not only learn more about an individual and a community that I was mostly unfamiliar with, but also as an opportunity for me to share what my experience is like as an atheist in a largely religious society, and to share what my experience is as a queer person in a largely heteronormative society are. And it was an opportunity for me to do so for an individual in a community that doesn't often have conversations about those things. And so I decided, as I was reflecting on that I wanted to take another look at religion and see if I could find a way to enter into more of those kinds of conversations of mutual care and concern that promoted understanding and cooperation between myself and other atheists and religious believers. So I went back to school to study religion again, and I decided I wanted to study it in an environment in which people were preparing for ordained ministry, because I wanted to learn how religious communities function, how they organize, who leads them, and what sort of coheres them, and how they relate to communities other than their own. And as I was doing that, I began getting involved in interfaith work. And I worked for an organization called Interfaith Youth Corps, which brings together college and university age students for interfaith dialogue and community service projects. And as I was doing this work, I became sort of increasingly convinced that this kind of dialogue is profoundly important, especially given the sort of moment that we're at in history, given that the United States is one of the most religiously diverse societies in the history of the world, but religious illiteracy is rampant. People know very little about religious differences, and they certainly really seem to have a hard time talking about them. And yet, as I saw the value in this, I also began to recognize that there weren't very many non-theists involved. And, I started to reflect on why that might be, and I felt like the sort of obvious answer is it's called interfaith work, and if you're an atheist, you see that and you probably think, well, that's for religious people. But I also wondered if there had to be something else to it. And as I was thinking about that, I began to recognize that a lot of the folks who were involved in interfaith programs had connected to them because of their religious community. Maybe they heard about an interfaith program, preached about in their church on Sunday, or maybe they read about it in their church bulletin, or maybe they read about it on their favorite Jewish blog or something. And so that really sort of spurred my interest in organized atheism and the atheist community, because I realized that I was working alongside all these people who were part of their own community, and I felt totally disconnected from a community of common belief. I felt like I was, I knew I was an atheist, and I was confident in that, but I wasn't really connected to other atheists in a real meaningful way. I had other friends who were atheists, but we were all just kind of like apathetic about it. We didn't talk about it. And I realized it was something I wanted to talk about more. And I began to suspect that organized atheist communities could provide a great forum for non-religious people to become involved in interfaith dialogue. And sure enough, there was a book that came out just a couple of years ago called American Grace by Robert Putnam and David Campbell. It was, I think it still is, the most extensive study of religious Americans that has ever happened. And in the book, they report on what they found, and one of the things that they found is that religious Americans are much more civically engaged than the non-religious. So they give more money to charity, both religious charity and secular. They're more likely to run for political office, they're more likely to volunteer in charitable initiatives. But they found that the correlation between religiousness and civic engagement had little or nothing to do with how devoutly religious a person was. So it wasn't, that the more that they believed, the more civically engaged they were. It was instead connected with how involved they were in their community. And they found, actually, that a non-believing spouse of a religious person was as likely to be civically engaged as their believing spouse if they were a part of their partner's religious community. And based on this research, they speculated that non-religious communities could serve a similar function in equipping and connecting non-religious people to civic engagement initiatives such as community service programs and interfaith dialogue events. And so as I began to recognize this, I realized that I really wanted to be a part of an atheist and a humanist community, not only because I saw a real value in interfaith dialogue, but also because I wanted to be a part of that community for much of the same reason that I converted and became a Christian when I was younger. Because even as I've gotten older and I've become more confident and independent, I still want to have that community of people where I know that I can fall back on a group of people if something happens. I know that I can get together with a group of like-minded people and we can learn from one another. They can push me to think more critically about my own beliefs and to consider ideas that I hadn't considered before. And so for the last few years I've been very involved in the humanist community at Harvard, and more broadly have gotten much more involved in the larger atheist and humanist movement in the United States and worldwide, and have found my experiences in that community to be really enriching. But I also, as someone who sort of comes from an interfaith organizing background and is very passionate about this idea of interfaith cooperation, have found that there's been some pushback against the idea in atheist circles. Surprising, I know. I'm sure this is brand new information to all of you. But, so I want to sort of speak to that a little bit, and now I'm going to switch to my notes because I'm not, if you couldn't tell, public speaking is not my favorite thing in the world. I don't know if you noticed the swaying side to side happening up here. Thank you. So I want to talk about that a little bit, but I need to lean on my notes a little bit more than I usually do. So, one of the things that in talking about the need for interfaith dialogue, one of the things that I've done is talk about the sort of current state of the atheist movement and the kind of messaging that comes out of the atheist movement right now. In particular, the sort of, the most visible public figures of atheism. And, in Faitheist and in my work in general, I've been a little bit critical of some of my fellow atheists, mostly P.Z. Myers and David Silverman. And that's basically it. I don't have as many criticisms for people like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, although, well, Sam Harris is another story, but Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett, because I actually really appreciate a lot of what they do, and I think that as much as Richard Dawkins sometimes says things that I find sort of deeply problematic, I also think that he tends to be somewhat misrepresented in the media as being, more...
a bigot.
A bigot, right, as a bigot, or abrasive. He's abrasive occasionally, we can give him that, right?
Strident.
Or strident.
Yeah.
Condescending. Oh, suddenly we're doing word association. What else? Bring it on.
English!
I have a funny story about Richard Dawkins, but I'll tell it later. You can ask me during the Q&A if you really want to know, because I don't want to get off track here. But if you want to know, I have a funny story about Richard Dawkins. Anyway, so, I have been somewhat critical of those things, and, at certain moments people have asked me, why not just sort of do the interfaith thing, promote that, and say, different strokes for different folks, essentially. And my issue with that is that I think that sometimes the most visible public expressions of atheism contribute to and reinforce a lot of the stereotypes that exist about atheism, which is precisely what atheists being involved in interfaith work sort of sets out to challenge. And as I'm trying to build bridges to religious communities and reach out and have that kind of dialogue, I find that that is actually much harder based on a lot of these conceptions that exist about atheism. And I think we can rightly place a lot of the blame for these stereotypes on religious believers who have promoted them. But I think that one of the things that makes this kind of bridge building harder is that the most visible representation of atheism is one that is seen as not interested in dialogue, but rather is just interested in monologue. And so, when I take issue with so-called new atheism, I really just take a particular issue with a particular sort of new atheist activism, which is what I see as an exclusive focus on religion as the source of human problems. Because I think that that is short-sighted, and I think that when I hear people paint religious believers with sweeping generalizations, I think it's not only unfair, but it's also inaccurate. And as an atheist and as a skeptic, I want to try and be as accurate as I can when I speak. And I certainly don't always do the best job, but that's something that I strive for. But I do want to say that, and this is something that we've tweeted about, this is something that I've talked with other people about, I want to be very clear that my issue isn't with new atheism. And in fact, I work very closely with people who self-identify as new atheists. I work closely with one of my coworkers, calls herself an evangelical atheist. She thinks that religion is inherently a bad thing, it's a harmful thing, and that she wants to see a world without religion, and yet she also is one of the staff members who's dedicated to working on our interfaith programs, because she thinks that it's unlikely that we're going to see a religion-free world anytime soon, and so in the meantime she wants to try to build understanding and promote pluralism. And so, I think that I just want to sort of put to rest the idea that all new atheists, and we could have a much longer conversation about what that even means, but I want to put to rest the idea that all new atheists are bad, or that all religious criticism is, something that we should avoid. But I think another common critique of interfaith work is that people will ask why we need interfaith efforts specifically. The response is, I work every day alongside people who believe different things. I volunteer at a soup kitchen alongside religious people all the time. So why do we need to do these things called interfaith? Why not just work alongside people who have different beliefs? And, I make a set of arguments in Faitheist for that, why I think interfaith efforts are particularly important, and I won't go into all of them right now because I still have some stuff I want to get through, and I don't want to talk all night because I want to hear from you. But one reason why I think that interfaith work is particularly important is because of, as I said earlier, a lot of the negative stigmas against atheists. When I go to colleges and universities, often I'll do a workshop with students, and one of the first things that I do in that workshop is I ask them to do a word association activity, and I'll lay out a few words, and I'll ask them to share what comes to mind when they hear these words. And when I say the word atheist, the responses are almost exclusively very negative. And I think that is the reality that we live with right now. These are the associations with this term. And as much as that exercise makes me cringe, I think that it's important that we bring to light the fact that these are the stereotypes that exist. And I think that interfaith contexts present an opportunity to challenge those negative connotations, because when atheists and people of faith meet face to face and self-identify themselves as atheists or as people of faith, the preconceived stereotypes that people have about other groups inevitably reveal their flaws. And then as we're doing this work, we can gain allies in different communities who can go back to their own communities and say, when they hear someone say something bigoted about atheists, they can respond with and say, well, actually atheists aren't all that bad. I have friends who are atheists, and I don't want you to say that. And so in that sense, interfaith engagement is unique because it puts religious differences at the forefront of the work that you're doing, at the forefront of the conversation. And atheists who are involved in interfaith work can no longer be tokenized as, simply the atheist neighbor who happens to be a good person. And instead, with our atheism at the forefront, we show that how our atheist and humanist values inspire us to be good people. And we demonstrate not only our shared values with religious people and a common sense of humanity, but we also help legitimize atheists as a moral community of people. And these kinds of relationships can be hugely transformative. If you look at the LGBT movement, a Gallup poll that was taken a few years ago in the United States found that the overwhelming majority of people who support same-sex marriage have a relationship with someone who is gay-identified. And more recent data found that of the 14% of Americans who changed their mind from opposing gay marriage to supporting it in the last decade, the #1 reason that they cited for why they changed their mind is because they had a relationship with someone who was gay. Similarly, there was this study of Hindu and Muslim communities in India, and they found that in communities where Hindus and Muslims lived alongside one another, there was this series of inciting incidents that led to intergroup violence, extended intergroup violence. But there was this one community where that didn't happen. And so they looked at this community and they were trying to figure out why this didn't happen. And they learned that in this community, about a decade or two beforehand, there had been, I think it was an earthquake or some natural disaster, that had forced the whole community to come together, to work together, and to build these intentional relationships between the communities. And once those relationships were in place, when these inciting incidents occurred, they were already friends, they already saw one another as neighbors, and it didn't result in that kind of violence. So I think that these kinds of interfaith efforts that intentionally bring groups together to do common work and to build intentional relationships are valuable. And I admit that the term interfaith can be problematic. It is problematic. And I yearn for a more accurate and better label to describe the work of bringing people of different religious backgrounds together. And I would love to get some feedback on better words, but most of the ones that I've come across are really clunky, and I just don't see them catching on. And I think in the meantime, we as atheists can participate in these efforts, and by doing so, the language will evolve as more atheists get involved. I can say I worked for the Interfaith Youth Corps, and when I started as an atheist, the language was highly religious, and now if you look at all of their materials, they specifically say, we work with students of religious and non-religious beliefs, or we work with students of different faith and philosophical perspectives. They explicitly reference the non-religious in every material that they have whenever they're describing what the work is that they do. Another example is an organization I work with in Massachusetts. It was called Social Action Ministries. It was an interfaith organization. But as we began to work with them, they started asking what we thought about the name and whether we thought that it was exclusive for some people. And based on our conversations, they changed their name to Social Action Massachusetts because they wanted, and they sort of wrote this announcement explaining why, saying that they wanted to communicate that their work was something that was not exclusively for the religious. So I think that this kind of language will evolve, but I think it happens by atheists getting involved. So in terms of atheists being involved in interfaith work, I think that an atheist that wants to do this kind of work will necessarily have to grapple with what attitude he or she wants to take toward religion or religious beliefs and the people who participate in religious communities. And so in that vein, it's been suggested that interfaith work asks non-believers to put their beliefs aside in order to just get along, sing Kumbaya. Personally, I don't care for Kumbaya. If you like it, that's fine, but it's not my cup of tea. You know, I can't speak for all interfaith activists who are atheists, but that is not the case for me. The pursuit of truth matters to me. I think that a naturalistic worldview that prioritizes scientific skepticism provides the best lens to consider the world. And I have often relished debates about the legitimacy of religious claims. It's something I loved doing as a religion major and as a master's student. You know, as an example of this, when I was doing my master's, I was working with a professor who at one point asked me, you know, you talk about justice and reconciliation and love. You know, when I talk about those things, I use the word God, and why can't you just use the word God? We're talking about the same things. You know, I don't think God is some bearded person in the sky. And we had this extended argument about the fact that words have consequences, and you know, for me, it's important to try and be as accurate as I can be when I'm talking about what I believe. And so, you know, we had that kind of conversation, and I think that that kind of conversation is valuable. And I think that these kinds of debates are important to have about our religious differences. I just believe that the best context, the most constructive context for these debates is when you have a relationship with the person that you're talking about them with, when you trust them, when you see them as a friend, because you're much more likely to be able to listen to them, and they're much more likely to be able to listen to you. And I also think that it's worth asking, when we advocate for something that we think is true, what our underlying goal is. You know, what kind of world are we working toward? You know, is there enough value in persuading believers out of religion if this change in their beliefs doesn't also change their approach to other important questions? You know, it seems to me that I have a lot more in common with someone who believes in God but also values scientific progress and human rights than I do with an atheist who believes that women are inferior to men. You know, I've heard people argue that the best way to fight injustice is by opposing religion altogether. You know, claiming that a world without religion would be a more just one. And this argument is often supported with a quote from theoretical physicist Steven Weinberg. You might know it. It said, "With or without it, you would have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. But for good people to do evil things, that takes religion." But to me, this idea neglects to account for the fact that religion has been cited as both the source of good and bad actions. And it's an overly simplistic assessment of what I think is a very complex issue. I mean, basically, good people do evil or at least morally questionable things all the time, often without any kind of religious influence at all. And even for atrocities that seem to be religiously motivated, the data suggests that people's motivations are actually quite complex. There was research done by social psychologists at the New School for Social Research and the University of British Columbia that found that prayer to God, which is an index of religious devotion, was mostly unrelated to support for suicide attacks. And instead, they found that attending religious services positively predicted support for suicide bombing, but because it builds coalitional commitment, in the same way that being a religious American makes you much more likely to be civically engaged. But this same phenomenon is also present in more secular groups. For example, Sri Lanka's nationalistic and non-religious Tamil Tigers have used similar mechanisms to recruit support for suicide attacks, and they're responsible for more suicide bombings than any other group since the 1980s. Robert A. Pape challenges the supposed link between terrorism and religious extremism. He says, what more than 95% of all suicide terrorist attacks since 1980 have in common is not religion, but a secular goal, which is to compel modern democracies to withdraw military forces from the territory that the terrorists view as their homeland. Now, according to Dr. Pape, who is the director of the Chicago Project on Suicide Terrorism, where religious forces do become most relevant is in demonizing the enemy and building out-group hostility, which I think supports the idea that humanizing religious diversity, which is the goal of interfaith dialogue and cooperation, is actually very vital. And so I'm skeptical of the claim that we should, as activists, focus on bringing about an end to religion, and I think instead we should work with religious allies to directly tackle the very real problems of dogmatism, authoritarianism, rigid tribalism, and social pressure, and focus on promoting access to education. And having allies in those religious communities who can advocate within those communities for change, who can speak the language of those communities, who can tell the stories that are seen as valuable in those communities, is indispensable. Now, in one discussion shortly after Faitheist was released, a commentator suggested that eliminating ignorance is actually more important than eliminating injustice or suffering, and that if eliminating a particular ignorance resulted in greater suffering, it would still be a net positive. I myself cannot bring myself to agree with that. And I actually find that statement reminiscent of Mother Teresa's view that suffering was good if it brought people closer to God, for which Christopher Hitchens rightly tore her apart. I think that a commitment to knowledge is important, but it's not the only commitment. You know, as a humanist, in a world full of suffering that is splintered by religious disagreements, I think we should sometimes prioritize the pursuit of justice over pursuing philosophical agreement, especially because hostile arguments over matters of truth frequently do little more than convince all involved of their own correctness. In the face of hostility, few people become more open, and more often than not, they simply become defensive of their beliefs. I think that you can be honestly and strongly critical of religious beliefs and doctrines while also acknowledging each individual's right to his or her personal beliefs, even if they seem totally irrational to you. You know, Christopher Hitchens once said in a debate with Tony Blair, "I propose a pact with the faithful. As long as you don't want your religion taught to my children in school," and we can assume here that he's not talking about world religion classes, right? BC survey. "Given a government subsidy imposed on me by violence, any of these things, then you are fine with me." And I think that this kind of attitude creates space for atheist religious cooperation on important matters like secularism, education, scientific and social progress, while also allowing everyone to be honest about their disagreements. And frankly, I'm more concerned about whether someone shares most of my core values, such as pluralism and the freedom of conscience, social cooperation and compassion and education, than I am about whether they are religious or not, and whether they believe in God or not. Many religious believers are at the forefront of efforts to promote human flourishing, and those shared concerns are much more important to me than the fact that we don't agree about the existence of any gods. I don't think that we should de-emphasize concerns about truth, but I think while we pursue truth together, we can work for justice now. I think it's unlikely that we'll see a world without religious belief anytime soon, but I think that there are important issues of human suffering that we can work to resolve right now. And by working together, religious believers and unbelievers, we can accomplish a lot more. And at the same time, we can work for the destigmatization of atheists, which will eventually contribute to the decrease of ignorance. We can encourage a more civil and open dialogue about faith and reason, which might help bring people to terms with the prejudices that might be currently preventing them from considering an alternate point of view. I would like to live in a more reasonable world where people aren't so defined and divided by their religious differences. I think that increasing access to education and promoting critical thinking and challenging beliefs that are wrong is vitally important. I think that critiquing unreasonable and dehumanizing beliefs is a very important tactic, but I think that the spirit of that criticism makes a significant difference. I think atheist activists and public figures who engage in generalizations and stereotypes that dismiss all or a majority of believers as roadblocks to social progress actually increase the divisiveness of religious differences. And while I support efforts to denounce female genital mutilation in Indonesia, I oppose campaigns spearheaded by prominent atheists to characterize the entire religion of Islam as barbaric. I think that these sweeping claims are not only difficult to support, they don't actually do much to address problematic practices in some Islamic societies. And they facilitate cultural divisions between Muslims and atheists. I think it's hard to see such irresponsible generalizations as doing more than contributing to ignorance by promoting untruths and fueling the tribalistic divisions that inhibit intergroup communication and cooperation. So, I think that is my position on so-called new atheism, and I think that it's, I'm very interested in having more of a conversation about that. But what I'm really most passionate about is, recognizing that there are some problems there. What can we do sort of moving forward? And I believe that participating in these kinds of interfaith dialogues is a really important thing for atheists to be doing. I don't think all atheists have to do it. I mean, it's something I happen to enjoy, and so I know I'm biased, but I also know it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea. But I do think that having those representatives there is really important for the atheist community. And I think that we gain those kinds of allies by being at the table, by telling our stories and demystifying atheism. And I think that storytelling is a really important way to begin to bridge those gaps, because stories are stories are what enable us to communicate our values to one another. That's a quote from sociologist Marshall Gans. And psychologist Dan McAdams says that narrative guides behavior in every moment and frames not only how we see the past, but how we see ourselves in the future. So bringing diverse people together to share their stories with one another, to participate in a civil dialogue, and to cooperate on shared values can help break down the walls that currently exist between different communities. This is why I decided I was going to write Faitheist as a memoir, because I wanted to share my story. And at the end of the book, I invite readers to respond by sharing theirs, to share theirs with me, to reach out to other people and share theirs. And I hope that as a society we can move to a place where we are more able to have conversations about religious differences, even in light of our vast and important disagreements. Because I think that despite areas of disagreement, significant as they are, we must find ways to build understanding across lines of religious difference and then work together to advance our shared goals. We may not agree on the existence of God or an afterlife, but we can agree that life in the here and now requires that we find a way to work together. I don't think we really have a choice.